The lipstick stain on Richard's collar told me everything I needed to know. I stood in our bedroom, his crumpled dress shirt dangling from my trembling fingers, my world crashing down around me. "Laura, have you seen my blue shirt?" Richard's voice echoed from downstairs. I swallowed hard, composing myself. "I'm ironing it now, honey." I lied, my voice unnaturally high. I shoved the shirt into the hamper and grabbed another from his closet, my mind racing. As I descended the stairs, Richard appeared at the bottom, looking impatient. "There you are. I'm running late for my meeting." I handed him the fresh shirt, studying his face. Did he look guilty? Nervous? I couldn't tell anymore. "Here you go. Have a good day at work." He pecked me on the cheek, the scent of his cologne making my stomach churn. "Thanks, babe. Don't forget Ava has soccer practice at 4. "I know," I said, forcing a smile. "I've got it covered." As soon as the front door closed behind him, I sagged against the wall, my mind whirling. How long had this been going on? Who was she? And how could I have been so blind? My phone buzzed, startling me. It was a text from Alice, my best friend. "Coffee at Rosie's in 20?" I hesitated, then typed back, "See you there." At the cafe, Alice waved me over to our usual corner table. Her smile faded as she saw my face. "Laura, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I slumped into the chair across from her. "I think Richard's cheating on me." Alice's eyes widened. "What? No way. Richard would never." "I found lipstick on his collar," I cut her off. "And it's not the first time I've suspected something. He's been working late, taking mysterious phone calls." Alice reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry. Are you sure it's not just a misunderstanding?" I shook my head, tears threatening to spill. I don't know what to think anymore. I feel like I'm losing my mind. "Have you talked to him about it?" "No," I admitted. "I'm scared of what he might say. What if he leaves me? What about the girls?" Alice's face softened. "Laura, you can't live like this. You need to confront him." Just then, my phone rang. It was the school. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Nurse Jenkins. Lily's running a fever. Can you come pick her up?" I sighed, gathering my things. "I'll be right there." Alice stood up with me. "Go take care of Lily. And Laura, promise me you'll talk to Richard tonight." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I hurried out of the cafe, my mind was a jumble of worries and fears. How could I face Richard? What would happen to our family? At the school, I found Lily curled up on a cot in the nurse's office, her cheeks flushed. "Mommy," she whimpered, reaching for me. I scooped her up, feeling her forehead. "It's okay, baby, we're going home now." As we walked to the car, my phone buzzed again. A text from Richard, "Working late tonight, don't wait up." My stomach clenched. Another late night, another lie. At home, I tucked Lily into bed and called my mother. "Mom, can you watch the girls tonight? I need to talk to Richard." "Of course, dear," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Is everything all right?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure. I'll explain later." After Mom arrived, I paced the living room, rehearsing what I'd say to Richard. The clock ticked past 8, then 9. Still no sign of him. At 10:30, headlights swept across the front window. I steeled myself as the key turned in the lock. Richard stumbled in, reeking of alcohol. "Laura, what are you still doing up?" I stood, my heart pounding. "We need to talk, Richard." He frowned, swaying slightly. "Can't it wait until morning?" "No," I said firmly. "It can't." As I opened my mouth to continue, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face paling. "Who is she, Richard?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes met mine, a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about." But I knew. In that moment, I knew everything had changed, and I was ready for a fight. The morning after my confrontation with Richard, I woke up with a pounding headache and a hollow feeling in my chest. He'd slept on the couch, and I heard him shuffling around downstairs, probably getting ready for work. I couldn't face him. Not yet. I reached for my phone, desperate to talk to someone who would understand. Alice answered on the second ring. "Laura? Are you okay? You never called me back last night." I took a deep breath. I confronted Richard. It didn't go well. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Do you want me to come over?" "No, I have to get the girls ready for school. But can we meet for lunch? I really need to talk." "Of course. Rosie's at noon." I agreed and hung up, feeling a small measure of relief. At least I had Alice to lean on. The morning passed in a blur of school lunches and rushed goodbyes. Richard left without a word, just a guilty glance in my direction. By the time I got to Rosie's, I was a bundle of nerves. Alice was already there, a steaming mug of coffee waiting for me. "Spill," she said as soon as I sat down. I poured out everything: the lipstick, the late nights, the suspicious text messages. Alice listened, her face a mask of sympathy and shock. "I can't believe Richard would do this to you," she said, shaking her head. "You and the girls deserve so much better." "I don't know what to do, Alice. I can't just leave him. What about Ava and Lily?" Alice reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "You have to think about yourself, too. You can't stay in a marriage where you're not respected." I nodded, fighting back tears. "But how do I even start? I've been with Richard for so long. I don't know who I am without him." "You're Laura Thompson," Alice said firmly. "You're a fantastic mother, a brilliant HR executive, and my best friend. You're strong enough to get through this." Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Your husband is cheating on you. Meet me at the park on Oak Street at 3 p.m. if you want proof." My hands shook as I showed Alice the message. "What do I do?" She frowned. "It could be a trap, but don't you want to know for sure?" I bit my lip, torn between fear and the desperate need for answers. "Will you come with me?" Alice nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Quajos, I've got your back, always." The rest of lunch passed in a haze of anxiety. At 2:55, Alice and I arrived at the park, scanning the area for anyone suspicious. "There," Alice pointed to a bench where a woman sat, her face hidden by large sunglasses and a scarf. As we approached, the woman stood up. "Laura?" I nodded, my heart racing. She handed me an envelope. "I'm sorry," she said softly before hurrying away. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Richard with another woman, kissing, holding hands, entering a hotel. My stomach lurched as I flipped through them. "Oh, Laura," Alice whispered, her face pale as she looked over my shoulder, but I barely heard her. My eyes were fixed on one photo in particular, the woman with Richard. I knew that dress, that hair. I looked up at Alice, my world tilting on its axis. "It's you," I whispered. Alice's eyes widened in panic. "Laura, I can explain." But I was already backing away, the photos clutched to my chest, my best friend's betrayal burning like acid in my throat. "Laura, please," Alice called after me as I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, locking the doors and letting out a primal scream of rage and pain. How could they do this to me? My husband and my best friend? As I sat there, shaking and sobbing, my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "Now you know the truth. What are you going to do about it?" I stared at the message, a cold determination settling over me. They thought they could destroy my life? Well, two could play at that game. It was time for Laura Thompson to fight back. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The betrayal of Richard and Alice burned in my chest, but I couldn't fall apart now. I had to pick up the girls from school. As I pulled into the school parking lot, my phone rang. It was Gary, Alice's husband. My stomach clenched. "Laura? Have you heard from Alice? She's not answering her phone." I swallowed hard. Should I tell him? I saw her earlier at lunch. Is everything okay?" Gary's voice was tight with worry. "There's been a fire at our house. I can't reach her, and I'm stuck in traffic. Can you check if she's there?" My world tilted again. "A fire? Of course, Gary. I'll head there right now." I called my mother, asking her to pick up the girls. Then I sped towards Alice and Gary's neighborhood, my mind racing. As I turned onto their street, I saw the flashing lights of fire trucks and ambulances. Smoke billowed from their beautiful two-story home. I parked haphazardly and ran towards the scene. A firefighter tried to stop me, but I pushed past him. My friend might be in there. That's when I saw them. Richard and Alice, huddled together near an ambulance, looking shell-shocked. They were alive, but their clothes were singed, and Alice had an oxygen mask over her face. Relief warred with fury inside me. I stormed over to them, my hands shaking. "What the hell is going on?" Richard's eyes widened when he saw me. "Laura, I can explain." "Explain what?" I hissed. "How you and my best friend nearly got yourselves killed, how you've been lying to me for God knows how long." Alice pulled off her oxygen mask, tears streaking her soot-stained face. "Laura, please. It's not what you think." I laughed bitterly. "Really? Because I think it's exactly what I think. I saw the photos, Alice. I know everything." Richard stepped forward, reaching for me. "Photos? What photos?" I jerked away from him. "Don't touch me. Don't you dare touch me." A commotion behind us made us all turn. Gary had arrived, his face a mask of panic and confusion as he took in the scene, his partially destroyed house, his wife with another man. "Alice," he called out, pushing through the crowd. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Alice's face crumpled. "Gary, I'm so sorry." I watched as Gary's expression shifted from concern to understanding, then to devastation. My heart ached for him, even as my own pain threatened to overwhelm me. A police officer approached us. "We need to ask you all some questions about the fire. It appears to have been deliberately set." The world seemed to stop. "Arson?" I looked at Richard and Alice, seeing the guilt and fear in their eyes. What had they done? As the officer led us away to separate us for questioning, I caught a glimpse of a familiar face in the crowd. It was the woman from the park, the one who had given me the photos. She nodded at me once, then disappeared into the throng of onlookers. In that moment, I realized this was far from over. The fire, the affair, the mysterious woman, it was all connected somehow, and I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The officer gestured for me to follow him. "Mrs. Thompson, if you could come with me, please." I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. As I walked away from the smoldering ruins of Alice and Gary's home, and the smoking remains of my own marriage, I knew my life would never be the same. But I was ready to fight for the truth, for my daughters, and for myself. Whatever came next, Laura Thompson would face it head on. The officer opened the door of his cruiser. "After you, ma'am." I slid into the back seat, my mind already racing with questions. As the door closed behind me, I caught one last glimpse of Richard and Alice, huddled together in the chaos. This was just the beginning. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room made my head throb. I'd been here for hours, waiting for news about Richard and Alice's condition after the fire. The police had finished questioning me, but my mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Thompson? Your husband is awake now. You can see him if you'd like." I nodded, steeling myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. As I walked down the sterile hallway, my anger and hurt bubbled up inside me, threatening to spill over. Richard was propped up in bed, his face pale against the white sheets. When he saw me, his eyes widened with a mixture of guilt and fear. "Laura," he started, but I cut him off. "Don't," I said, my voice low. "I don't want to hear your excuses or your lies. I want the truth, Richard, all of it." He sighed, deflating like a punctured balloon. "I never meant for any of this to happen, but it did happen," I snapped. "You and Alice, how long?" Richard looked away. 6 months. The admission hit me like a physical blow. 6 months of lies, of betrayal. I sank into the chair beside his bed, my legs suddenly weak. "Why?" I whispered. "Why her? Why throw away our entire life together?" "I don't know," he said, and I could hear the genuine confusion in his voice. "It just happened. Alice and I, we connected in a way that—" "Stop." I held up a hand. "I don't need to hear about your connection. What I need to know is what happened at the house. The police think it was arson, Richard. Did you have something to do with that?" His eyes widened in shock. "What? No, of course not. We were just talking. Then suddenly there was smoke everywhere. We barely made it out." I studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, but all I saw was fear and remorse. "Laura," he reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I'm so sorry, for everything. I know I've ruined everything, but maybe we can." "No," I said firmly, standing up. "There's no we anymore, Richard. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. Richard's face crumpled, but I felt a strange sense of relief. It was out there now. There was no going back. "What about the girls?" he asked quietly. "I'll be filing for full custody," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "You can have supervised visitation, but that's it. You've proven you can't be trusted." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but a commotion in the hallway interrupted us. I turned to see Gary bursting into the room, his face a mask of fury. "You bastard!" he yelled, lunging for Richard. I stepped between them, pushing Gary back. "Gary, stop! This isn't the place." He glared at me. "Did you know? Were you covering for them?" "No," I said softly. "I just found out too. I'm so sorry, Gary." The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a bone-deep weariness I recognized all too well. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice breaking. I took a deep breath. making a decision that would change all our lives. We're going to fight back, together. Richard, Alice, whoever started that fire, they're not going to get away with this. Gary nodded slowly, a spark of determination igniting in his eyes. You're right, we deserve better than this. I turned back to Richard, who was watching us with a mixture of fear and resignation. I'll have my lawyer contact you, I said coldly. Goodbye, Richard. As Gary and I walked out of the hospital room, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was on the right path. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it head-on. The days following the hospital confrontation passed in a blur of lawyer meetings and hushed phone calls. I'd managed to keep the girls shielded from the worst of it, but I knew I couldn't protect them forever. As I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers my lawyer had just delivered, my phone buzzed with a text from Gary. We need to talk. Meet me at Rosie's in an hour? I hesitated, then replied, I'll be there. At the cafe, Gary looked as haggard as I felt. He slid into the booth across from me, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Thanks for coming, he said. I found out something disturbing. I leaned forward, my heart racing. Gary pulled out his phone, showing me a series of text messages. These are from Alice's phone. I shouldn't have looked, but I had to know. As I scrolled through the messages, my blood ran cold. They were between Alice and Richard, discussing not just their affair, but something far more sinister. Oh my God, I whispered. They were planning to leave us, to take the kids and disappear. Gary nodded grimly. There's more. Look at the last few messages. I kept reading, my hands shaking. The final texts were about the fire, confirming what I'd feared all along. It wasn't an accident. They set the fire themselves, I said, my voice barely audible, to collect the insurance money and fund their new life. Gary's face was a mask of pain and anger. We can't let them get away with this, Laura. We have to do something. Just then, my phone rang. It was the hospital. Mrs. Thompson, it's about your husband. He's demanding to be released, but we need your consent as his emergency contact. I looked at Gary, an idea forming in my mind. Don't release him, I told the nurse. I'll be there in 20 minutes. As we rushed to the hospital, I filled Gary in on my plan. It was risky, but it might be our only chance to get the truth. At the hospital, we found Richard arguing with a nurse. When he saw us, his face paled. Laura, what are you doing here? And why is he with you? I stepped forward, my voice steady. We know everything, Richard. About the affair, the fire, your plans to take the kids. It's over. Richard's eyes darted between us, panic setting in. You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We never meant to hurt anyone. But you did, Gary growled. You betrayed us. You put lives at risk. For what? Money? Richard slumped back onto the bed, defeated. Alice said it was the only way, that we needed a fresh start, away from all the lies. I felt a surge of anger. And what about our children, Richard? Did you think about what this would do to them? He couldn't meet my eyes. I'm sorry, Laura. I've made such a mess of everything. Just then, a commotion in the hallway caught our attention. Alice burst into the room, her face wild with panic. Richard, don't say another word, she cried. Then she saw Gary and me, and her expression crumpled. Oh, God, you know. The four of us stood there, the weight of betrayal and destruction heavy in the air. I looked at Gary, seeing my own pain and determination mirrored in his eyes. In that moment, I made a decision that would change all our lives forever. I pulled out my phone and dialed. This is Laura Thompson. I need to speak to Detective Johnson about the arson case. I have some new information. As I spoke to the police, I watched Richard and Alice's faces crumble with the realization that their carefully constructed plans were falling apart. This was it, the point of no return. Whatever happened next, I knew our lives would never be the same. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the chance for justice and a new beginning. The hospital room crackled with tension as Detective Johnson finished taking our statements. Richard and Alice sat on opposite sides of the room, their faces ashen. Gary stood beside me, a silent pillar of support. Mr. Thompson, Miss Carter, the detective said, his voice grave. Based on the evidence and your confessions, you're both under arrest for arson and insurance fraud. As the officers moved to handcuff them, Richard's eyes met mine, pleading. Laura, please, think of the girls. We can work this out. I felt a surge of anger. You should have thought of them before you decided to burn down a house and abandon your family. Alice sobbed as she was led away. Gary, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. Gary's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. As Richard and Alice were escorted out, Detective Johnson turned to us. We'll need you both to come down to the station for further questioning. I nodded, my mind racing. Of course, but first I need to make arrangements for my daughters. Outside the hospital, I called my mother. Mom, I need you to keep the girls overnight. Something's happened. After explaining the situation, I hung up, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. Gary touched my arm gently. Are you okay? I shook my head, fighting back tears. I don't know how I'm going to tell the girls their father's been arrested. How do you explain something like that to children? Gary's eyes softened with understanding. We'll figure it out together. You're not alone in this, Laura. At the police station, hours passed in a blur of questions and paperwork. As we were finally preparing to leave, my lawyer arrived, looking grim. Laura, we need to talk, she said, pulling me aside. Richard's lawyer is already pushing for a plea deal. They're trying to use your children as leverage. My heart sank. What do you mean? They're threatening to drag out the divorce proceedings, fight for custody, unless you agree to a more favorable settlement for Richard. I felt the room spin. After everything he'd done, Richard was still trying to manipulate me through our children. Gary overheard and stepped closer. That's blackmail. They can't do that, can they? My lawyer sighed. Legally, no, but they can make things very difficult and drawn out. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. When I opened them, I saw Gary watching me with concern. In that moment, I made a decision. No, I said firmly. I won't let him use our daughters as pawns. We fight this all the way. My lawyer nodded, a hint of admiration in her eyes. It won't be easy, but I think it's the right call. I'll start preparing our counter-strategy immediately. As we left the station, the weight of the day's events hit me full force. I stumbled, and Gary caught my arm. Whoa, easy there, he said softly. Let's get you home. In the car, I finally broke down, sobs racking my body. Gary pulled over and simply held me, letting me cry. When I finally calmed down, I looked up at him. How did we get here, Gary? How did our lives fall apart so completely? He shook his head, his own eyes glistening. I don't know, but we're going to get through this. Together. As we pulled up to my house, I saw my mother's car in the driveway. The girls were home. Reality crashed back in. I had to tell them about their father. Gary squeezed my hand. Do you want me to come in with you? I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. No, I need to do this alone. But can you come by tomorrow? I think I'm going to need all the support I can get. He nodded, his eyes full of understanding. I'll be here. Whatever you need, Laura. As I walked to my front door, I felt like I was heading into battle. The hardest conversation of my life awaited me on the other side. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. Whatever came next, I knew I had the strength to face it. I opened the door, ready to face my new reality head-on. The courtroom buzzed with tension as I sat beside my lawyer, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. Across the aisle, Richard glared at me, his eyes cold and unforgiving. The judge cleared his throat, silencing the room. In the matter of Thompson versus Thompson, we're here to discuss the terms of alimony and child support, the judge announced. My lawyer stood, her voice steady. Your Honor, given Mr. Thompson's recent legal troubles and the circumstances surrounding the dissolution of the marriage, we believe full custody should be awarded to my client with supervised visitation for Mr. Thompson. Richard's lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. My client's legal issues are separate from his ability to parent. We're seeking joint custody. The judge raised an eyebrow. Counselor, your client is facing arson charges. How do you propose he co-parent from jail? As the lawyers argued, I felt a gentle touch on my arm. Gary had slipped into the seat behind me, offering silent support. I gave him a grateful smile. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open. Alice stumbled in, looking disheveled and frantic. Wait! I need to speak! The judge banged his gavel. Order, ma'am. You can't just barge in here. Alice ignored him, her eyes wild as she approached the bench. You don't understand. It wasn't Richard's fault. I was the one who started the fire. The room erupted in chaos. Richard's face paled, while his lawyer looked like he might faint. I sat there, stunned, as Alice continued her confession. Richard tried to stop me, but I wouldn't listen. I thought if we had the insurance money, we could start over, but it was all my idea. The judge called for order, his face stern. Miss Carter, are you aware that you're confessing to a felony in open court? Alice nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. I just couldn't let Richard take the blame anymore. Our children deserve to know the truth. As the bailiff led Alice away, the judge turned to the lawyers. In light of this new information, we'll need to recess. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. Outside the courtroom, my head was spinning. Gary stood beside me, his face a mix of shock and concern. Laura, are you okay? I shook my head, struggling to process what had just happened. I don't know. I thought I had it all figured out, but now? My lawyer approached, looking grim. Laura, we need to talk strategy. This changes everything. As she outlined our options, I found my thoughts drifting to Ava and Lily. How would this affect them? How could I protect them from all this chaos? Suddenly, I saw Richard walking towards us, his lawyer trailing behind him. My body tensed, ready for another confrontation. But when he reached us, his face was different, softer, somehow. Laura, can we talk? Alone? Against my better judgment, I nodded. We stepped aside, away from the others. Richard took a deep breath. I know I've made a mess of everything, but I want you to know, I never stopped loving our girls, or you. I felt tears pricking at my eyes. Richard, it's too late for that. He nodded, looking defeated. I know, but I want to make this right. For the girls. Whatever you decide about custody, I'll support it. No more fights, no more lawyers. Just tell me what you need. I stood there, overwhelmed by the sudden shift. Part of me wanted to lash out, to make him hurt the way I had. But another part, the part that remembered the man I'd fallen in love with, saw a glimmer of that person in his eyes. I need time, I said finally. To think, to process all of this. Can you give me that? Richard nodded, relief washing over his face. Of course, whatever you need. As he walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions washing over me. Anger, confusion, a tiny spark of hope. I turned back to Gary and my lawyer, both watching me with concern. What now? Gary asked softly. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. Now, we fight for what matters most. My daughter's future. As we walked back into the courtroom, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Whatever happened next, I knew I had the strength to face it. For myself and for my girls. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in months, I felt like I might just win the war. The moving truck rumbled away, leaving me standing in the driveway of my new home. Ava and Lily raced inside, their excited squeals echoing through the empty rooms. I took a deep breath, savoring the crisp autumn air and the sense of possibility that came with it. Need a hand with those boxes? I turned to see Gary walking up the path, a warm smile on his face. Over the past few months, he'd become an unexpected source of strength and friendship. I'd love some help, thanks, I said, grabbing a box. As we carried the last of our belongings inside, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Richard. Hope the move went well. The girls settled in okay? I hesitated before replying. They're excited. Thanks for asking. Our relationship had evolved into a cautious co-parenting arrangement. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than I'd ever imagined during those dark days of the divorce. Mom, can we set up our rooms now? Lily called from upstairs. Coming, sweetie, I called back, then turned to Gary. Want to stay for dinner? It's just pizza, but... He nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I'd like that. As we worked on unpacking, my mother arrived, arms laden with homemade casseroles. I thought you could use some real food, she said, kissing my cheek. The house slowly came to life with laughter and chatter. As I watched Ava showing Gary how to properly arrange her stuffed animals, I felt a warmth spread through my chest. This wasn't the family I'd imagined, but it was beautiful in its own way. Later that evening, after the girls were in bed and Gary had gone home, I sat on the porch with my mother, sipping tea. You know, she said softly, I'm so proud of you, Laura. You've handled all of this with such grace. I felt tears prick at my eyes. It doesn't feel like grace most days. I still get so angry sometimes thinking about what Richard and Alice did. Mom squeezed my hand. That's normal, dear, but look at what you've built from the ashes of that betrayal. You're stronger now, and your girls are thriving. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a news alert. I gasped as I read the headline. Local business owners face bankruptcy after failed insurance scam. The article detailed Richard and Alice's financial downfall, their reputations in tatters. For a moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction, quickly followed by pity. They'd lost everything, while I'd gained a new life. What is it? Mom asked, concerned. I showed her the article, watching as her eyes widened. Oh, Laura, how do you feel about this? I took a deep breath, surprised by my own response. Honestly, I feel free, like the last tie to that old life has been cut. Mom nodded, understanding in her eyes. You've come so far, sweetheart. Your father would be so proud of you. We sat in comfortable silence watching the stars come out. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the moments of despair. But I also thought about the strength I'd found, the friendships that had deepened, and the love that had sustained me. As I looked out at the quiet street of my new neighborhood, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was full of promise. You know, I said softly, I think we're going to be okay. Mom squeezed my hand. More than okay, dear. You're going to thrive. I smiled, feeling the truth of her words in my bones. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I had the strength to face them. And I had a family, not the one I'd expected, but one built on love, trust, and resilience. As I headed inside to check on the girls one last time, I paused in the doorway, looking back at the life I'd left behind. Then, with a small smile, I stepped forward into my new beginning, ready to embrace whatever came next. The door closed softly behind me, the sound of a chapter ending and a new one beginning. In the quiet of my new home, surrounded by the love of my daughters and the support of true friends, I felt a surge of hope for the future. It wasn't the happily ever after I'd once dreamed of, but it was real, it was mine, and it was beautiful. The sound of Alex's voice sliced through the clatter of dishes like a sharp knife. Alara, bring me some tea now. I paused, my hands submerged in soapy water. Hold on, I'm doing the dishes. What? His tone was incredulous, laced with impatience. Stop that and bring me the tea quickly. Can't you follow simple orders? But I started, only to be interrupted. What a useless wife you are. Make me some sweet coffee, please. It was Mrs. Whitmore, my mother-in-law, speaking from the living room. She sat there, devouring a slice of cake she'd taken from the fridge, her eyes glinting with malice. I sighed, glancing at the mountain of dishes. There are so many. Leave them for later. Just do what we say, useless wife. Alex's voice was a whip, each word stinging. I was Alara, a 28-year-old working mother, trapped in a life that felt more like a prison than a home. Married at 23, I had hoped for love and companionship. Instead, I found myself in the clutches of Alex and his overbearing mother. Our son, only 4, was the sole source of joy in my bleak world. We lived in Alex's parents' house, a decision forced upon me under the guise of caring for Mrs. Whitmore after my father-in-law's passing. Initially, I sympathized with her supposed grief, but soon it became clear that I was nothing more than a pawn in her cruel game of domestic tyranny. Cooking, cleaning, working, it was never enough. My efforts were met with scorn, my meals left untouched or criticized harshly. The stir-fry is so half-hearted, Mrs. Whitmore would scoff. Cook it properly from scratch. I'm busy and can only make simple things, I'd respond, trying to keep my voice steady. That's why I hate backtalk from a daughter-in-law, she'd snap. Cook from scratch. Why don't you cook then? You're a good cook, right? I dared to retort once, immediately regretting it. Why would I do housework when you're here? Her response was cold, dismissive. Are you out of your mind? Their cruelty escalated over time, shifting from harsh words to a chilling silence. They began to ignore me completely, as if I were a ghost haunting my own home. My presence, once merely undervalued, now seemed entirely invisible. 5 years passed in this suffocating atmosphere. Alex and I turned 35 and 33, respectively. Our son grew, yet the oppressive air in the house remained unchanged. My mother-in-law, now 63, seemed to thrive on my misery. One evening, as I trudged home from work, a heavy realization settled over me. My existence seemed pointless in their eyes. I was a shadow, unseen and unheard. The only voice that acknowledged me was that of my son. The thought of losing even that small recognition was unbearable. Returning home, I began cooking immediately, trying to push away the gloom. I prepared mapo tofu, fried chicken, and a stir-fry with bell peppers and pork, hoping to bring some semblance of normalcy to our dinner. "Bring me the mayo," Alex commanded abruptly, breaking his long silence. "Sure, here you are," I replied, handing him the mayonnaise. His first words to me in ages were not of gratitude or conversation, but a mere order. It was the final straw, the breaking point of my patience and tolerance. The evening took a turn for the worse when Mrs. Whitmore demanded, "Clean the toilet." "What? Now?" I was aghast. "Yes, now," she insisted, her voice dripping with venom. I snapped back, unable to contain my frustration. "Don't say such a thing while we're eating. It's nasty." "Just like your heart," she hissed. Our argument escalated quickly, with Alex interjecting, demanding I apologize to his mother. But I refused, standing my ground for the first time in years. The conflict reached its peak, and in that moment, a decision crystallized within me. I needed to escape this toxic environment, not just for my sake, but for my son's as well. I retreated to my room, my resolve hardening. I downloaded divorce papers, filled them out, and slammed them in front of Alex. His shock was palpable, but I felt nothing but a cold determination. "I'm filing these," I declared, my voice steady. As I stood there facing my husband's bewildered expression, I realized I had finally stepped out of the shadows. It was time to reclaim my life. The days following my declaration of divorce were a whirlwind of cold glares and biting remarks. But amidst this storm, I found an unfamiliar sense of liberation. One evening, as I served dinner, Mrs. Whitmore looked at the meal with disdain. "You call this food? Even a child cooks better." I bit my tongue, focusing on my son's smiling face. "Eat up, sweetheart. I made your favorite tonight." Alex chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, playing the perfect mother now, are we? What a joke." I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, but I kept my composure. "I'm just trying to make a nice dinner for our son." Mrs. Whitmore snorted. "Don't act high and mighty. You're just a burden in this house." The tension at the table was palpable. Alex's attempts to belittle me only intensified. "So, Alara, have you thought about how you'll survive after the divorce? You can barely keep a house, let alone your own life." I looked him straight in the eye. "I have been supporting this family for years. I'm not worried about taking care of myself and our son." His smirk faded slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Mrs. Whitmore quickly intervened. "Don't be absurd. You need us more than we need you." The conversation turned to finances, a topic they usually avoided. "You do realize that without my salary, this household would crumble?" I stated, more to myself than to them. Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. "We'll manage. We don't need your pity money." But Alex's silence spoke volumes. He knew the truth. Without my income, they would be in dire straits. In the following days, their behavior became increasingly erratic. Mrs. Whitmore would oscillate between trying to sweet-talk me into staying and hurling insults when I didn't comply. Alex, on the other hand, seemed lost, his arrogant facade crumbling as the reality of his financial dependence became undeniable. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between them that chilled me to the bone. "She can't leave us like this," Alex hissed. "We need her money." Mrs. Whitmore's reply was cold and calculated. "Don't worry. I have a plan. We'll make her life so miserable she won't dare to leave." Hearing their true intentions laid bare was a revelation. They didn't care about me or even our son. It was all about control and money. That night, as I lay in bed, a plan began to form in my mind. If they wanted a battle, I would give them one. But it wouldn't be fought with words or petty arguments. I would hit them where it hurt the most, their pride and their pockets. The next morning, I started putting my plan into action. I contacted a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who came highly recommended. "I want a divorce, and I want to make sure they don't get a penny more than they deserve," I told her. She nodded, her eyes glinting with determination. "We'll make sure of that. You've been the sole breadwinner, right? We'll use that." As the days passed, my resolve only grew stronger. I started documenting everything, the insults, the financial manipulation, even the smallest of grievances. It was time to turn the tables. It was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. And as I built my case, a sense of empowerment filled me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. The shadows of contempt were slowly lifting, and in their place, a new dawn was emerging. As the divorce proceedings began, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly toxic. Yet, With each passing day, my sense of fear diminished, replaced by a steely resolve. One evening, Mrs. Whitmore tried a different tactic. "Alara, dear, why don't we forget all this nasty business? You know we're family." Her words dripped with insincerity. I met her gaze, unwavering. "Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me." Alex, who had been quietly observing, scoffed. "Oh, playing the victim now? You're not as innocent as you pretend to be." I felt a surge of anger, but kept my voice calm. "I'm not playing anything, Alex. I'm just no longer willing to be your scapegoat." The conversation turned, as it often did, to finances. "You think you can just take our son and leave? How will you support him?" Alex challenged. I smiled, a small, confident curve of my lips. "I've been supporting this family for years. I think I can manage." Mrs. Whitmore's expression twisted into a sneer. "You're nothing without us. You'll come crawling back." But their words no longer held power over me. I knew my worth, and I knew the truth. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. She laid out the strategy clearly. "We'll expose their financial dependency on you. It will play a crucial role in the custody battle and the division of assets." I nodded, feeling a sense of vindication. The law was on my side, and I was ready to fight. Back at home, the tension reached a boiling point. Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to undermine me became more desperate. "You think you're so smart," she spat one evening. "But you're just a cold-hearted woman, abandoning your family." I looked her straight in the eyes. "No, I'm a woman who's finally standing up for herself." Alex jumped in, his voice laced with venom. "You'll regret this. You can't survive without me." But his threats fell on deaf ears. I was done being intimidated. As the days went by, my preparations for the court battle intensified. I gathered financial statements, recorded their abusive remarks, and collected evidence of their negligence. One afternoon, as I was organizing my documents, my son came to me. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" His voice was small, uncertain. I pulled him into a hug, feeling a surge of protectiveness. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine. We're leaving this place, and we're going to start a new, happy life. Just you and me." His arms tightened around me, and in that moment, I knew I was making the right decision. I was fighting, not just for myself, but for my son's future. The day of the court hearing loomed closer, and with it, a sense of impending freedom. I was ready to face Alex and Mrs. Whitmore, ready to end their reign of control and emotional abuse. I was ready to reclaim my life and give my son the peace and happiness he deserved. It was time for justice, and I was determined to see it served. The day of the court hearing arrived, a day I had been anticipating with a mix of dread and determination. As I sat across from Alex and Mrs. Whitmore in the courtroom, I felt a sense of surrealism. This was the moment where everything would change. The proceedings began with a cold formality. Alex's lawyer portrayed him as a devoted husband and father, struggling under the weight of false accusations. Mrs. Whitmore played the part of the grieving mother-in-law, wronged by an ungrateful daughter-in-law. But their performance was transparent, their lies brittle. When my turn came, I spoke clearly, my voice steady. "I have been the sole provider for this family for years. My husband's unemployment and his mother's manipulation have been constant sources of strain." Alex interjected, his voice laced with false hurt. "Alara, how can you say these things? I've always supported you." I turned to him, my gaze unwavering. "Support is more than just words, Alex. It's about actions, and your actions have shown nothing but selfishness and cruelty." The judge listened intently as I presented my evidence. Financial statements, recordings of their verbal abuse, testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed their behavior. The truth was undeniable. As the evidence mounted, Alex's facade began to crumble. Mrs. Whitmore's composure cracked, her mask of innocence slipping away. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Then came the revelation that sealed their fate. My lawyer presented photographs and documents proving Alex's infidelity and Mrs. Whitmore's illicit affair with a wealthy neighbor, Mr. Harwood. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the images were displayed, showing them in compromising positions, their deception laid bare for all to see. Alex's face turned ashen, his eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Whitmore's expression twisted into one of fury, her hands trembling. You invaded our privacy!" Mrs. Whitmore shrieked, her voice shrill. I looked at her, my voice calm but firm. "No, I exposed the truth. a truth that you both have been hiding for too long." The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Their credibility was shattered, their lies exposed in the harsh light of the courtroom. As the hearing came to a close, the judge's verdict was clear. I was granted full custody of our son, and a fair division of assets was ordered. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were left with little more than their shattered reputations. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The years of manipulation and emotional abuse were finally over. I had stood up to my oppressors and emerged victorious. But the sweetest moment came when my son ran into my arms outside the courthouse, his face bright with relief and happiness. "We did it, Mom," he said, his voice filled with joy. "Yes, we did," I replied, holding him close. "We're free now. It's just the beginning for us." And as we walked away, hand in hand, I knew that this was not just a victory for me. It was a victory for every person who had ever been made to feel small, powerless, or unworthy. It was a victory for truth and justice. It was the start of a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope and the promise of a brighter future. The aftermath of the court ruling was immediate and tumultuous. Word of Alex and Mrs. Whitmore's deceit spread like wildfire, tarnishing their reputations in our small community. They were no longer able to hide behind their facade of respectability. In the days following the verdict, I focused on rebuilding my life with my son, but I couldn't ignore the sense of satisfaction that came from knowing Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were facing the consequences of their actions. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Mr. Harwood's wife, Mrs. Harwood, her eyes red with unshed tears. "Alara, I heard about everything. I can't believe what Sylvia, Mrs. Whitmore, did." Her voice broke, and I could see the pain etched on her face. I invited her in, offering a cup of tea. As we sat at the kitchen table, she poured out her heartache. I trusted her as a neighbor, as a friend, and to think she was having an affair with my husband. I listened, offering words of comfort. It was clear that Mrs. Whitmore's actions had caused more damage than she had ever anticipated. The next day I encountered Alex in town. He was a shadow of the man he once was, his arrogance replaced by a look of defeat. "Alara, please, can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stopped, facing him. "What is there to talk about, Alex?" He fidgeted, unable to meet my eyes. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't realize how much I depended on you, on your strength." His apology, though late, was a testament to the shift in power. He had lost everything. His dignity, his home, his family, and in that loss he had finally recognized his own faults. But it was Mrs. Whitmore who faced the harshest backlash. Her affair with Mr. Harwood had not only ruined her reputation, but had also led to legal troubles. Mrs. Harwood had filed for divorce and was pursuing a lawsuit against her for alienation of affection. I heard about Mrs. Whitmore's plight from neighbors, the whispers and rumors painting a picture of a woman undone by her own actions. She had become an outcast, shunned by those she had once considered friends. One afternoon, I saw her at the grocery store, her eyes downcast as she hurried through the aisles. Our paths crossed, and for a moment our eyes met. The look of resentment and defeat in her eyes was unmistakable. "You did this to me," she hissed under her breath as she passed by. I watched her go, feeling a mix of pity and vindication. "No, Sylvia, you did this to yourself," I whispered to myself. The tides of justice had turned, and the consequences of their actions were now inescapable. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were living the life they had crafted through years of deceit and manipulation. And as I watched them struggle with the aftermath, I knew that the best revenge was living well, free from their toxic influence. As I turned my focus back to my son and our new life, I realized that this was not just a story of revenge. It was a story of liberation, of breaking free from the chains of abuse and control. And as I looked to the future, I knew that the best was yet to come.